The orc woman held the gate with trembling hands, starving, when she asked only for bread and water. The farmer almost closed the door like everyone else had done. But when he saw her tears mixing with the rain, he understood that this woman had already been abandoned by the entire world. But to understand how they arrived at that gate, we must go back, 2 months before, when the war still lived in everyone's bones. The storm hit Ravengard like a fist. Merrick had been finishing up in the barn when the sky split open. Thunder rolled low across the iron frontier, the kind that made horses stamp and dogs go silent. He grabbed the lantern off the hook and pulled his coat tight, moving fast through mud that sucked at his boots with every step. The main house was dark. It was always dark these days. He had learned to stop noticing it. The single plate on the table, the cold side of the bed, the way a house that once held 2 people felt 3 times as large when it held only 1. 5 years since the war ended. 1 winter since Edra died. He had counted every night since by the number of times he woke to silence instead of her breathing. The lantern swung as he crossed the yard. 3 knocks reached him through the rain. Faint. Almost nothing, the kind of knocking that apologizes for itself. Merrick slowed. Most travelers came through the front road and knocked on the main door. These knocks came from the side gate, the old cattle gate no one used anymore, rusted half shut and half hidden by overgrown thornbrush. A lost rider wouldn't find it, a desperate person might. He raised the lantern. The figure at the gate didn't move. She stood absolutely still, both hands wrapped around the iron bars, fingers pale from the cold and the grip. She was soaked through, no cloak, no boots, no pack. The rain had flattened her dark hair against her skull, and her shoulders shook in slow, steady tremors she seemed to be trying to control. Merrick's hand tightened on the lantern handle. She was an orc. Green-skinned, broad-shouldered, athletic in the way of her kind, built for endurance, for terrain, for survival. But there was nothing threatening in how she stood. No weapon at her hip, no hardness in her posture. She looked like someone who'd been walking too long and finally run out of road. Her eyes met his through the rain. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at the lantern, then at his face, then at the gate between them, as if calculating something. How many times she had done this, perhaps? And how many times the door had closed before she finished the sentence. Then she said it. Bread and water. Her voice was steady, quiet. That is all I ask. Merrick stood in the rain and the lantern light and did not move. He had fought orcs in the Varrock campaign. He remembered the size of them, the painted faces, the battle cries that rattled through chest and bone. He remembered coming home with a scar across his shoulder and the smell of smoke in his hair for weeks afterward. This woman shared none of that with his memory. She shared something else, the same look he had seen in the mirror the morning after Edra's burial. The look of someone who has already accepted that the answer will be no and has come to the door anyway because there is nothing left to lose. He almost turned back. The rain fell harder. He looked at her hands on the gate, the knuckles white, the whole body barely holding itself upright, and he saw her drop her gaze toward the ground, angling her head so the water ran across her cheeks and hid whatever was there. It didn't hide it. Merrick unlatched the gate. She did not move immediately when the gate swung open. Elira stood in the rain and looked at the space between the open gate and the lantern light and the man holding it, and for 1 long second she did not know what to do with an open door. She had knocked on 7 doors in 3 towns. She had learned to prepare herself for the sound of bolts sliding shut. She had not prepared herself for this. "Come inside," the man said, not warmly, not coldly, just a fact. She followed him across the yard. The mud was deep here, the kind that told her this land had been worked for years, worn paths between barn and house and well, each one shaped by routine. She noticed the barn before the house. She noted the distance between them. Old habit. In the clans, you always knew your exits. Inside the kitchen, heat hit her like a wall. The fire was low but alive, banked for the night. The room smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and something that might have been stew from hours ago. A single candle burned on the table. One chair pushed close to the fire, one plate beside the basin, unwashed. The man set the lantern down and didn't look at her. He moved to the bread bin, pulled out a half loaf, set it on the table, filled a cup from the water jug, said nothing. Elira sat where he gestured, on the bench. Not the chair by the fire, because the chair by the fire belonged to someone who lived here and she did not. She understood the difference between a place offered and a place that was yours. She ate slowly at first. The bread was 2 days old. It was the best thing she had tasted in a week. Her hands were steadier now that she was out of the rain, but when she reached for the second piece, her fingers betrayed her, shaking, not from cold, but from the particular exhaustion of a body that had rationed itself down to almost nothing. The chunk of bread slipped from her grip and hit the floor. She was off the bench before it stopped moving. Crouching, she picked it up fast and clean, the movement automatic, the kind that came from understanding that whatever fell was still yours if you were quick enough. She straightened and found the man watching her, not with disgust, not with pity, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. She placed the piece of bread on the table edge. She would not eat floor bread in front of a stranger. She still had that much. "I'll be gone before morning," she said. He pulled the bread back to the center of the table. "Eat it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the bread. She ate it. The fire crackled. The rain drummed on the roof. Outside, somewhere in the dark, Rovengard slept its uneasy sleep. A frontier town built on old battle lines, 5 years removed from the treaty and still counting the cost. Every door with a bar across it. Every face with the calculation behind the eyes. Friend or threat. Merrick sat down on the far side of the table. He didn't speak. He didn't leave either. Elira kept her eyes on the cup. "They all closed the door," she said. Not accusatory, just true. "Most would," he said. She lifted her gaze to him. "Why didn't you?" He didn't answer right away. The candle guttered in a draught. He looked at the flame, then back at her, and something crossed his face that she recognized without being able to name it. "You were crying," he said, "in the rain." She looked away first. 5 years had not been enough. That was the truth no one in Ravengard said out loud, but everyone understood. The Treaty of Ashford had ended the killing. It had not ended the counting. How many sons lost to the Eastern Campaign, how many burned homesteads in the Varrock territories, how many names carved into the stone at the garrison gate that no one visited anymore because it hurt too much and too little at the same time. Merrick had 3 names on that stone, 2 cousins, a friend. He rubbed the scar on his left shoulder sometimes, without noticing he was doing it. The army had called it a minor wound. He had spent 3 weeks in a field tent learning what the word minor meant to men who had seen the alternative. In Ravengard, any orc was still read as a threat. It was not hatred exactly, or not only that. It was the particular fear of people who had been hurt and healed and were not confident they could survive being hurt again. The war had left everyone standing in the ruins of their own certainty. They had been told orcs were enemies. Many of them had watched an orc be an enemy. The idea of walking away from that story required more trust than most people in this town had left to give. While the farmer fed a stranger in his kitchen, on the other side of Ravengard, in the back room of the Ashwood Tavern, Brennor was already talking. He was a big man, red-faced, the kind of loud that filled a room before he entered it. He had fought in the South Campaign. He had come home and opened a feed store and married a woman who was afraid of him and told himself that was love. He heard things. He repeated them louder than he'd heard them. "Merrick let one in," he was saying, to the 3 men around the table who had stopped pretending to play cards. "Saw the light in his kitchen myself, standing right at his gate in the storm. Could have been passing through," one of them said. Brenor set his cup down. Orcs don't pass through Ravengard. They come here for something. None of them pointed out that he had no evidence of this. Evidence had never been the currency in these conversations. Fear was. Back at the farm, Merrick banked the fire higher. He had not decided to do this yet. He was not deciding. He was only building a fire, which was a thing he knew how to do, and not looking at the woman sitting at his table, which was a thing he was getting through moment by moment. She had stopped shaking. That was the thing that settled somewhere in his chest, watching the trembling slow and still as the warmth reached her. She hadn't asked for warmth. She had asked for bread and water, the smallest possible request, the kind you make when you have already rehearsed every reason you deserve to be refused. She had asked for crumbs and nothing more, and he had looked at her face in the rain and seen the exact weight of that. He had seen it because he knew it, not from war, from the first month after Edra died, when he had moved through the house like a visitor in a place he used to belong to, eating because the body insisted, sleeping when it became unavoidable, giving himself only what he could not refuse to have. She had asked for bread and water because that was all she believed she deserved. He understood that language. Idra had loved the mornings. She had been awake before him every day of their marriage. Fire going, water heating, the particular domestic noise of a person moving through a space they owned fully, every gesture a kind of ownership. He had liked waking to those sounds. He had never told her that. He had assumed there would be more time. There had not been more time. The first winter after the war had been brutal in ways that hadn't made it into the garrison reports. Not the fighting, which was mostly over by then, but the cold. The fever that moved through the farming settlements like a slow tide. Edra had fallen sick in the 4th week of frost and been dead by the 6th. No enemy sword, no grand sacrifice, just a body that ran out of resistance at the wrong time. Merrick had built her grave himself. He had not wanted anyone to help him. He did not know why. He had kept farming because farming was what you did. The house had been perfectly functional and perfectly empty. He cooked for one. He worked for one. He existed in a kind of mechanical forward motion that was not grief exactly. Grief had a shape, a peak, a passing. This was more like the absence of a thing he had forgotten how to describe. He had not been lonely. He had simply been alone. Now, in the grey light before dawn, he sat by the kitchen window with his coffee cooling in his hands and listened to the storm ease off toward the mountains. The bench by the table was empty. He had given her the old wool blanket from the cedar chest and expected her to be gone before he woke. She was in the barn. He watched through the window, the lantern light moving behind the gap in the barn doors. He stood. He looked at it for a moment longer than made sense. Then he set his cup down and went to see. She had already fed the horses. She was working on the stalls now, methodical, quiet, the kind of work done by someone who knows livestock and doesn't need to be shown. The big grey Harlan, who trusted no one in weather moods, was eating calmly from his trough. She had already figured him out. Merrick stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I fed them," she said. "I didn't know if they'd eaten." They hadn't. She nodded and went back to the stall. She moved like someone who had decided to justify being here before anyone told her she needed to, pay every debt in advance, leave no bill open. He recognized that too. He had spent a lot of years paying invisible debts to the memory of a wife he couldn't bring back. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She kept working. He picked up the second pitchfork from the wall and started on the other side of the barn without discussing it. They worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the horses and the last rain on the roof and the soft rhythm of work that two people do when they have stopped trying to explain themselves to each other. When they finished, the light outside had gone from grey to pale gold. He said, "There's coffee." She followed him back across the yard without asking whether she was welcome to. The bread fell on the 3rd morning. They had found something like a routine by then. A lyra, In the barn before dawn, Merrick with the coffee, the shared silence of the kitchen that felt less uncomfortable each day, and more like the silence between people who have accepted each other's presence. She still sat on the bench, still ate quickly, as if speed would make her take up less space, but on the third morning she was slower, tired. She had worked hard the day before, mended 2 sections of fence, cleared the drainage channel behind the east field, split enough firewood to last a week. She had done it all without being asked and without complaint, and Merrick had watched from different angles throughout the day, trying to catch the moment when it would become too much. And it never did. She sat at the table and reached for the bread, and her hands shook. Not from cold, she was warm, not from fear. She had mostly stopped flinching when he crossed behind her. The shaking was the deep kind, the kind that lives in muscle and bone after the body has been pushed below its limits for too long. She had been surviving on will for weeks before she reached his gate, and will only carries a person so far before the body presents the invoice. The piece of bread hit the floor. She had it back in her hand before he could react. She placed it on the edge of the table and looked at it, and he saw the calculation. Eat it anyway because hunger, don't eat it because what would he think? And somewhere beneath both of those the simpler thing, I have been humiliated enough for one lifetime. "How many doors?" he said. She looked up. "Before mine," he said. "How many did you knock on?" She was quiet for a moment. 7, she said. "In 3 towns." He said nothing. "The first 3 didn't answer," she said. "The next 2 told me to move on before they brought the garrison. 1 threw water, 1 threw a stone." She paused. "Not a big stone." He picked up the bread from the table edge and placed it in the center of the table. "Why only bread and water?" he said. "You could have asked for more." She looked at the bread and then at him and said the thing she had not planned to say, the thing that came out flat and factual because she was too tired to dress it up. "Bread and water was all I believed a human would give me." The fire settled. The candle, a new one, he had lit 2 tonight, burned between them. She picked up the bread and ate it. Later, after she had gone to the barn, Merrick sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The second candle was still burning. He hadn't blown it out. He wasn't sure why, only that the room felt different with 2 lights in it instead of 1. He was thinking about a woman who had walked to 7 doors and been turned away from all of them, and had still arrived at an 8th, with her hands trembling, and asked only for what she believed the world would allow. He was thinking that he understood something about the particular discipline of lowering your expectations down to whatever won't hurt when it's denied. He was thinking that he had been doing the same thing in different rooms for almost a year. She talked about the Varrock clans like someone describing a place they loved and had lost. It was the 6th evening. They had eaten together. She had cooked, actually, without asking. Some root broth that smelled like something his grandmother used to make in autumn, and the fire was up, and the storm had stayed away, and for the first time Merrick could not identify a reason to want to be anywhere else in the world. He had asked about the clans carefully. He was aware of the line between conversation and interrogation, and he was aware that she was a woman who had every reason to distrust curiosity. But she answered. "The Varrock were traders and fighters and storytellers," she said. "They had clans that went back 10 generations in the eastern foothills, their own codes, their own history. She had grown up believing that the war was a mistake, not the orc side or the human side, just the whole thing, the entire structure of it, the insistence on choosing between fight and kneel when there was a third option no one with power ever chose. Peace was possible, she said. Before the campaign, I mean, before the first battle, there were traders, marriages between border families. My grandmother had a human friend she traded with for 40 years. What happened to her? Merrick asked. The war happened to her, Elira said. She set her cup down. I stopped a raid, she said quietly. Last spring. Young warriors. Boys, really. 14, 15. They had found a trade caravan coming out of Thorn Pass. 2 human families, 6 wagons, children. She looked at the fire. I rode ahead and stood in the road. Alone. They respected me because of my father's rank, for about 10 minutes. She almost smiled. Then they started calling me traitor. Merrick watched her face. I called them cowards, she said. I told them the war was over, and killing civilians in a ditch was not honor, it was cowardice, and that any of them who raised a weapon would have to go through me first. They backed down. Some of them. The raid didn't happen. She paused. But the clan council heard about it. 3 elders and my cousin, my own blood. They met and they decided I had betrayed the Varrock by preventing violence against humans. She said it plainly. No performance of pain, just the fact of it laid bare. They gave me until morning to leave. The fire popped. No food, she said. No silver, no horse, my knife, my clothes, the boots I was wearing. Merrick said nothing for a long time. The caravan families, he said finally. Did they ever know? She shook her head. No, she said. They just kept driving. He looked at the woman across the table, exiled from her own people for protecting people who never knew she existed, sitting in a stranger's kitchen on a frontier farm. Her hands wrapped around a cup that had finally stopped shaking, and felt the particular injustice of it land in his chest like something solid. She had been expelled from the only world she belonged to for doing the right thing. And she had come to his gate believing she deserved bread and water and nothing more. The second bowl appeared on the table on the 9th night. Merrick set it out without discussion. 2 bowls, 2 cups, the bread placed in the center rather than to one side. He went to the barn to call her for the evening meal and came back and sat down and waited. Elira came in, stopped when she saw the second bowl and stood in the doorway for a moment. She said nothing. She sat down. She did not eat immediately. She looked at the bowl, at the steam rising from it, at the deliberateness of the placement, at the simple fact that it had been put there before she arrived waiting for her, and something in her face went through a change too quiet to describe. The kind of change that happens when a person stops bracing for the withdrawal of something good. She picked up the spoon. It took her 4 more days to come in through the front door. In those 4 days she continued sleeping in the barn by choice, not by instruction. She'd made it clear she found it comfortable, which Merrick suspected was partially true and partially courtesy. She worked each day with the same focused intensity. But the work was beginning to shift, less like she was paying off a debt, more like she was caring for something that was partly hers. She started stacking the firewood differently, better, actually, a tighter row against the east wall that would keep more of the moisture out. She oiled the barn hinges without being asked. She noticed the 3 loose fence posts that Merrick had been mentally noting for weeks and had them repaired before he'd found the time. He noticed her noticing. One evening he came home from the mill in town, provisions, grain, the usual business, and found that she had cleared the overgrown thorn brush away from the side cattle gate, the one he had been putting off clearing for months, the one she had stood at, holding the bars in the rain, the night she arrived. He stopped and looked at it. The gate stood open now, the hinges worked, the path through it cleared. She had not mentioned it. She was at the well, drawing water, and she looked up when she heard him stop, and for a moment they just stood there with the cleared gate between them. I found the oil rag in the barn, she said. He nodded. Thank you, he said. She went back to the water. But that night she knocked on the front door, not the gate, not the barn entrance, the actual front door of the house, and when he opened it she said simply, "The floor by the hearth has a loose board," and handed him a small wedge of wood she had cut to fit. He stepped back to let her in. She walked through the front door. She knelt at the hearth and hammered the wedge in with the heel of her hand, 3 quick, clean strikes, and the board stopped rocking. She sat back on her heels and looked at the fixed floor, and Merrick sat in the chair by the fire and watched her, and neither of them said anything about the fact that this was the first time she had come through the front door, because some things did not need to be named. Brenner came on a Tuesday. He brought 4 men with him, Garrett from the mill, old Pole who ran the stockyard, and 2 younger men whose names Merrick knew but whose opinions he'd never had reason to consider before now. They came up the front road in the middle of the afternoon, when the sun was out and the mud had dried, and there was no weather to blame for anything. Merrick was at the fence line when he saw them. He came down from the east field slowly, making them wait, which was intentional. Inside the house, Alira heard the horses. She did not go to the window. She stood in the kitchen and listened, to the sound of hooves, to the number of them, to the way they stopped at the main yard gate rather than continuing to the door, the positioning of a group that was making a point about being a group. She recognized the formation. She had seen it before. She pressed back against the kitchen wall, out of the sight line of the front window, and listened. Brenner's voice carried. "You're a reasonable man, Merrick. You've always been a reasonable man." The kind of voice that makes reasonable sound, like an accusation. "People talk. You know they talk." "I know," Merrick said. "She's been here weeks now." "She has." "An orc woman, on your farm, working your land, sleeping in your barn." A pause. "Some people find that concerning." "Which people?" "People who buy grain from you, people who trade with you, people who have been loyal to this farm and to your family for 20 years. Another pause. "Garrett here. How much of your spring crop did he take last season, Merrick?" "Half?" Alira closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. She had watched it build in the sideways looks from the road, the silence at the well when she went for water, the particular way people found business on the other side of the street. She had seen it, and she had told herself it was her imagination, or that it would pass, or that it didn't matter, all 3 of which she knew were untrue. She had told herself she would leave before it cost him anything. She hadn't left. Outside, Merrick said nothing for long enough that she could hear the horses shift. Then he said, "She stays." Brenner's voice changed. "Merrick, she stays," Merrick said again. "You want to talk trade, talk trade. You want to talk something else, come back when you've got something worth saying." A long silence. Alira stood against the wall and heard it. She heard Brenner say something low that didn't carry. She heard the horses moving. She heard the sound of them leaving. Not fast, not dramatically, just leaving, the way a threat leaves when it's been declined without performance. She stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. Her eyes were dry. That surprised her. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for, something hollow and enormous and fragile, the particular feeling of being chosen by someone who understood the price and paid it anyway. She was still standing there when Merrick came through the door. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen. He set his hat on the hook. "There's still light," he said. "Fence on the north corner needs looking at." She picked up her work gloves from the table. "I'll start on the far end," she said. They went back to work. 3 days after Brenner left, the river rose. The storms had been moving in from the mountains all week, brief, heavy, the kind that drop more water in an hour than the ground can take. The Grevish River ran along the south edge of Ravengard, and the old stone bridge at its centre was the only crossing for 2 days in either direction. It had held through every flood in living memory. It did not hold this time. Alira heard the crack from the east field. A sound like a tree split by lightning, but lower and longer. Structural, final. Then the shouting started. She was already moving before she understood what she was running toward. The bridge had broken at its centre. 2 spans of stone and timber had dropped into the water, leaving a gap in the middle where the current churned white and fast and cold. On the near bank, people had gathered. Men, women, children who had been crossing the market road when the structure gave way. Most had made it back. Most A girl was caught between the broken sections. She was small, 7 or 8 years old, clinging to a timber beam that had lodged at an angle in the gap. The water was pulling at her legs. The beam was shifting. Around her, men on both banks shouted instructions to each other that the roar of the river swallowed whole. No one went in. The current was too fast. The gap was too wide. The water was mountain runoff, cold enough to steal movement from a grown man's limbs in minutes. Elira reached the bank and did not stop. She went into the river feet first, taking the current at an angle, using it instead of fighting it, aiming for the broken timber upstream from the girl. The cold hit like a blade, chest, arms, fingers, and she drove through it by force of will alone, catching the broken edge of the bridge with both hands and locking on. The girl was 2 arm lengths away, still holding, her knuckles white on the beam. "Don't let go," Elira said. "Look at me. Don't look at the water." The girl looked at her. Her eyes were huge with cold and terror. Elira worked along the broken edge, hand over hand, until she could reach. She locked her arm around the girl's waist and pulled her in tight against her chest. The girl's face pressed against her shoulder. Then she looked back at the bank. The timber groaned. It shifted. She had 3 seconds, maybe 4, before it went. She pushed off the beam with both legs, hard, angling for the near bank. The girl held across her chest with one arm while the other cut through the current. The cold had reached her bones by then. Her arms were slowing. She drove with her legs and kept driving and hit the shallows on her knees and hands and crawled the last distance out of the water onto solid ground. The timber behind her let go and went down in the rush. The girl was crying, coughing, alive. Ravengard was silent. Elira knelt on the riverbank with the girl in her arms and looked up and found every person on the bank looking back at her. Brennor was there. Old Poll was there. Garrett from the mill, who had stood in Merrick's yard and agreed with every threat, stood 3 feet away with his hat in his hands and nothing in his face that looked like the man from that afternoon. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the girl's mother came through the crowd and pulled her daughter away and held her. And the sound that came from her was not a word, but it was everything. Elira stood up alone on the bank, soaked through, her arms shaking from the cold and the effort, and she stood there until her breathing steadied. No one told her to move on. No one looked at her like a threat. They just looked. The days after the bridge were quiet in a different way than the days before it. No one apologized directly. No one stood in the road and made a speech. That was not how Ravengard worked, and Elira had not expected it to be, but things began to appear at the farm gate. A sack of flour set down without a name attached. A bundle of good firewood cut better than her own, a small pot of honey with a piece of cloth tied around the lid. A set of tools, good ones, iron-handled, left against the fence post by the road one morning before Merrick was awake. He found her standing at the gate, looking at the tools. "From Garrett," he said quietly, reading something in the way they had been placed. She didn't answer. She picked them up and carried them to the barn. She left in the dark before the 4th hour. She had planned it carefully, not out of cowardice, but out of the particular logic of a woman who has learned to weigh the cost of her presence against the people around her. Brenner's men had come and gone, but pressure had a way of returning in new shapes. The bridge had changed some faces, but not all of them. And she had spent enough of her life waiting for the goodwill of others to run out. She folded the blanket. She set the bowl clean on the shelf. She placed the remaining half-loaf of bread on the center of the table because she could not take his food, not even the bread, not after everything. She unlocked the front door. She stopped. She looked back at the kitchen. The banked fire, the 2 cups on the shelf, the fixed board at the hearth, the tools she had brought in from the gate, and she memorized it. She had learned to memorize things that were about to be taken from her. She stepped outside. The road out of Ravengard was mud and stones and cold air that smelled like the mountains 2 days west. She walked with her head down and her arms close to her body and told herself it was the right thing. It was the right thing. She had done the right thing once before and been expelled from her world for it, and here she was doing it again, and perhaps that was simply who she was. She was walking. She was not crying. She walked for almost an hour before she heard the horse. She didn't look back. She kept walking. The hooves got louder, and she kept walking, and then the horse drew alongside her and slowed, and she heard him say her name. She stopped. She did not turn around. Elira. She closed her eyes. "Come back," he said. "You'll lose everything," she said. "Your trade. You're standing in this town. These people have 20 years of loyalty to your farm, and they will pull it back if I stay. I am not worth that to you." The horse was still. The wind came off the hills. "You fed Harlan on the first morning," he said. "No one feeds Harlan. He bites." She said nothing. "You fixed the gate latch," he said. "The floorboard, the north drainage. You stacked the firewood better than I ever have." A pause. "You made that broth that smells like something I haven't smelled since I was 8 years old, and my grandmother was still alive." She heard him dismount. His boots hit the road. "The house has been quiet for a long time," he said. "I got used to it. I thought it was fine." He paused. "You were the first thing in a long time that made the quiet feel wrong." She turned around. His face in the dark was exactly what she expected. Serious, uncomfortable with the words, but more uncomfortable with the alternative. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know what it becomes. I only know that I woke up and you weren't there, and I was afraid in a way I haven't been afraid since a long time ago." He stopped. "I'm asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything else. Just come back." The road was cold. The stars were out. She looked at him for a long time. Then she walked toward him, and when she reached him she didn't say anything because she didn't have words that were the right size for this moment. She put her arms around him in the road, and he held her back. Not carefully, not tentatively, but the way a person holds onto something they almost lost. And she felt the exhaustion and the relief and the terrible, fragile thing of being chosen break through everything she had been holding in. She cried. She had been not crying for weeks. In the rain at the gate, after Brennor's men, on the riverbank with the girl in her arms and every face of Ravengard watching, in the kitchen when she picked up her gloves and went back to the fence. All of it collected and held, and now it came through. Her face against his coat and his hand at the back of her head, and the dark road empty around them. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and let the rain that wasn't there be there. After a long time she pulled back. She wiped her face. "The bread is still on the table," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to leave it. I know." He handed her the horse's rein. They walked back to the farm together, through the mud and the dark, the horse moving between them and the lights of Ravengard, small and distant, and the farm's single window lit ahead like something that had been waiting. She went in through the front door. She didn't look at the bread on the table when she passed it. She sat by the fire, and Merrick put the coffee on, and neither of them spoke about the road or the dark, or the fact that she had been on her way to disappear. They had said what needed saying. The rest could be silent. In the weeks that followed, Merrick noticed that he had started listening for her, not watching, listening. The sound of her boots crossing the yard before dawn, the particular knock of wood on wood when she loaded the fire from the side, the way she called from the barn door in the late afternoon when she wanted to know if supper was ready or if there was still work. Her voice carrying across the yard in a tone that had stopped being careful and started being simply hers. He did not tell her this. He didn't need to, because one evening she came in from the field and paused in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. Just looked, the way a person looks at a place they have decided is theirs. And then she said, quietly and without drama, "I couldn't picture this without you anymore." He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the second cup from the shelf and filled it. He set it on the table. She sat down. 2 years passed quietly over Ravengard. Elira and Merrick had a daughter, small and fierce, with skin the colour of late summer wheat touched with green at the temples and her father's dark eyes. They named her Idra. It was the right name for someone who brought warmth back into a house. The farm grew, not dramatically, not with any single great turn of fortune, but in the slow way that happens when two people work land together and each one sees things the other misses. The town changed slowly too. It did not make announcements about it. There was no ceremony, but one spring morning, children from 3 different families arrived at the East Field Gate to play, and among them were 2 young orcs from a trading family newly settled at the Ravengard edge, and no one's parents came to pull them home. Elira stood near the plantings and watched a human girl offer a fistful of wildflowers to her daughter, who took them with both hands. The way children take things they don't yet know are precious. She had never seen that world as a child. She had not known it was possible. Merrick came up beside her and took her hand without looking away from the field. "Look at that," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The peace that had not come from kings or treaties had come from here, from a lantern held up in the rain, from a gate opened instead of closed, from bread placed in the center of a table instead of to one side, from small choices made in small moments by people who had every reason to choose otherwise. The sun moved across the field, the children played, and the house behind them, which had been quiet for a long time, was quiet no longer. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orcbound Legacy.